Shall I start?
Yep.
Good. Can people at the back hear me?
Yes, yeah.
During the summer I had a bit of COVID, not very bad, but it's left me with a voice which is rather low and sometimes gives out completely. So if you suddenly can't hear, tell me and I'll stand up and project more strongly. Robin, I rely on you to warn me if... Good. Okay. Tiny bit of background. You have to take your mind back, if you're that old, which some people here are, and many aren't, to the 1960s, when some very bad population forecasting was going on. Bad, we can say, in retrospect. This is for the UK, but the same sort of thing applied to England. This yellow curve was the projected population of the UK in 1965. Well, it never went like that at all. It went like the red line, flattened out, and rose much more slowly in a trajectory like that in subsequent years. But the shock of going from that 1955-based forecast to the 1965-based forecast made it seem as though the UK was booming and was going to need loads of additional housing and everything else. Regional studies were set up to decide where to put it all, and it led to, among other things, a thing called the Southeast Study, which recommended a series of big new towns, of which one in North Buckinghamshire was going to be one, another in South Hampshire, and so on. And it's hard to imagine now, looking back, but there was quite a lot of local enthusiasm for these new town designations. And the Buckinghamshire County Council, which was very conservative, was rather keen to have a new town in North Bucks because the northern part of Buckinghamshire in those days smelt horrible. The main industry in Bletchley, which was the main town, was brick making, fletton bricks, which was a particular kind of clay and a particular kind of technology which produced extremely sulphurous smell, and the whole neighbourhood smelt really pretty awful, like Peterborough, which coincidentally also became a new town. It had a big working class population, it voted Labour mostly, it returned Labour MPs to Parliament, and generally Buckinghamshire was glad to be shot of it, I think, and particularly to have a new town there which took the pressure off the development of salubrious areas in the south of Buckinghamshire, and the Chiltern Hills and so on, which remain to this day the site of England's most expensive housing. So that's in a way how we got there. The county architect was very strongly in support of this thing, and you will know this, and I won't spend more than a moment on it, produced a scheme for a new town, a new city, based alongside the railway from London to Birmingham, with a town centre along the railway line alignment and monorail connections to a series of neighbourhoods of industry and housing joined together like beads on a string, which was very much in line with sort of progressive transport thinking in those days. However, and it was for the same kind of approach as seen in a study commissioned by the British government on where to put new towns in this area, and they commissioned a study from Wilson and Womersley, another firm of consultants, on Northampton, Bedfordshire, North Bucks, which produced this kind of beads on a string approach to towns along there. And you have to remember that the railway from Oxford to Bletchley to Bedford and on to Cambridge, which we're now discussing whether to rebuild it again, was working fully. So it was a crossroads for the railway system between London to Birmingham, London to Manchester, Oxford to Cambridge. And a new town there was designated under the New Towns Act in 1967. As was common in those days, the master planning was contracted to a consultant firm. while the Development Corporation spent a year or two setting itself up, recruiting staff, becoming an institution capable of implementing a new town. And in those 2 years or so, consultants worked on preparing a master plan. It was led by Richard Llewellyn-Davies and Walter Bohr, whose practice previously mainly been concerned with railway buildings and hospitals, which I don't know a lot about, but there's a very interesting literature about that. And they had a number of subcontractors, one of whom was Nathaniel Litchfield, who was my employer, my first employer when I left college in 1966. He was an economist and planner who was very famous for developing the application of cost-benefit analysis in planning. And it was, I would say, a sort of progressive, leftish kind of planner from an economics and real estate background. And I was a junior person in his office, and I was put to work on this Milton Keynes project, which was fantastically interesting and exciting, but I had, on the whole, very little influence, being really an office junior. And bear that in mind as I go along. But I'm one of the few survivors of that group of people. Most of them, a few are still around but abroad, but nobody else that I know is still around and here in England. And we did the work mainly in the offices of the Llewellyn-Davies Partnership. And just to put you on the spot geographically, it was in a building called 141 Euston Road, which is that office block in the middle of that picture. It had a petrol station in the ground floor. It had offices for the next 4 or 5 floors, and then some housing on top, thanks to the planning authority who'd insisted on that. And it's just behind St Pancras New Church on the corner of the Euston Road and Southampton Road. Really boring, ordinary office building, and that's where we did the plan for Milton Keynes. Now, for me, there are 3 main important things from that experience I had, and that's what I'm going to talk about, because I am not a scholar of Milton Keynes. I haven't kept up with it. There are many people in the room who really know the story. The thing I'm most proud of, and that I did and very pleased about, was to do an analysis in which I tried to forecast the income distribution of the future residents of the new town on various assumptions about the industrial structure. And that was the basis for a paper which argued that they really must build a lot of social housing in Milton Keynes, at least half the total housing stock in the early years, in order to achieve the kind of social mix and social diversity that they aspired to. And this was very much resisted by some of the Development Corporation board, particularly a man called, what was his name? Stanley Morton, who was the head of the Abbey National Building Society, who was on the board, partly to push the concept of owner occupation. And he was a great pusher for owner occupation, as much of it as possible. And we managed to persuade the board that that was a fantasy and they shouldn't do it. And they didn't. So that I'm rather proud of, but we're not going to talk about that today. The 2 things I do want to talk about now is, first of all, we were really attempting to minimize the adverse effects of a car-centric design. The way the Milton Keynes thing was set up, and David will know more about this than me, was that the people in the Ministry of Housing and the Development Corporation were absolutely adamant that they wanted a car-centric plan based on the wonderful motor car, which was liberating individuals to go wherever they like. But not, of course, at the total expense of public transport, to make sure there was a public transport system to cope with children and alcoholics and other people who couldn't drive for one reason or another. But it was very much going to be a car-centric thing, and some of us were working in the plan to try to minimize the adverse effects of that. And a related issue is that the whole planning process was based on a strong rejection of the idea of self-contained neighbourhoods, which had been a dominant concept in new town planning in North America and generally in Britain in the post-war new towns, and indeed had been picked up by Patrick Abercrombie in his thinking about London in the County of London Plan of whatever it was, 1943. Now, both of these two things, I think, failed. The attempts to minimize the adverse effects of the car-centric design, we really failed. And we really failed on this self-contained neighborhoods issue, essentially because the master plan that we all worked on was completely turned on its head in the implementation. And this is kind of well known among people who study Milton Keynes. There's Abercrombie's map of London on the left, seen as a series of self-contained, mutually exclusive neighborhoods. Part of the concept in this plan was to try to take advantage of the free and easy movement of people in their cars across the whole body of the city to distribute activity evenly across the city surface. And from the very beginning, this sort of plan was being promoted, which sees employment areas, which are in blue, spread across the whole area, office and retail areas quite widely dispersed. Not entirely so, not completely pure. There's a city centre, that big red central blob, which in a way is an anomaly and conflicts with the basic idea. But the basic idea was to do this spreading of activity across the city, using a grid of roads. We won't talk about that much in detail because there's a long story about the spacing. But the idea of this grid, as in the plan, was you'd have a series of roads intersecting at right angles, pretty much, controlled by traffic lights at the junctions, which would soon be synchronized with computers to allow flows of traffic in a tidal way. That vehicles would run on these main roads at speeds limited to 30 miles an hour, or in one bit of the plan it says 30 to 40 miles an hour, but very much regulated speeds. And that would allow quite a few side turnings, 3 or 4 side turnings in each grid square length, which was about 1,000 meters, about a kilometer. It would also allow lay-bys and stopping alongside the road in a fairly safe way. It would enable you to put service areas, shops, schools, libraries, whatever, alongside the road. And it was married with a policy of concentrating densities around the midpoints of these grid roads in that sort of pattern, diagrammatically. That these midpoints of grid roads will be the kind of places. I don't like this term placemaking, but if you were going to do placemaking in Milton Keynes, that's what you'd do. You'd take those midpoints as the center of a place, give that lot of stuff to an architect and then a developer. But no, that's not what happened. But that was the idea, that these would be the development parcels centered around these midpoints. And this was the key map in the plan showing how this would be done. And you can see on here that there are main roads, which are these grey lines, dual carriageways, but sometimes merging into a single carriageway, intersecting at right angles, and midway between two, there would be a concentration of activity, which might be schools, might be shops, might be libraries, might be more than one of those, and the densities would build up towards it and fall away towards the middle of the grid squares, where it would tend to be more green activity, allotments, or in some cases, the great enthusiasm of the chairman of the board, Lord Campbell, golf courses. He thought that was the thing of the future, golf courses, and lots of those were going to appear. But one of the examples which we kept being told about was the Aylmer Road shopping centre in Hampstead Garden suburb, which many of you will know. That's the A1 running through the middle, so it's rather too main a road to do this job very well, but it has lay-bys, it has shops alongside it, and residential areas behind. You can see the shops. Some of them are local shops that serve local needs, but there's no reason why you shouldn't also have a fishing tackle shop or a rare books shop or a jeweler or something which serves a larger market, because people are passing by and they can stop. But what in fact happened was completely different. The plan as crystallized by the Development Corporation staff when they were appointed and took over, built roundabouts instead of these traffic lights, which meant different kind of intersection. And in order to slow the traffic down, they kink the roads as they lead into the roundabouts, so this sense of orthogonal intersections is rather lost. They changed the speed limits, they deregulated the speeds of flow on these roads, and that in turn meant that you could really only have 1 or 2 intersections in each kilometre length for safety reasons. And it meant no stopping on the road, it meant no lay-bys, it means your service areas couldn't be facing the road. Indeed, the roads became rather noisy and dangerous. So what tended to happen was that the densities actually were in the middle of the grid squares, and the grid roads were lined with earth banks against noise and a lot of vegetation. And they were very proud of planting millions of trees to protect the soil from noise and fumes and stuff. And then on top of it all, it seemed natural to allocate the development plots in this kind of way. So in fact, each of the grid squares became a development parcel and a design parcel, and individual architects and developers were involved in each of those. So there are a series of separate changes which cumulatively had a big effect on the way the plan worked, and it carried on, and sites were still being marketed in this kind of way into the present century. Now, one could discuss, and you may want to, and David may have some comments here, why all this happened. Was it the capture by highway engineers and kind of petrol heads of the life of a potential town, wanting to go as fast as possible through the streets to get from A to B? Was that a factor? A factor which I think was very important to us at the time in making sense of what happened was government policy about density of social housing, where they were incredibly rigid. You could only get government grants and authorization to spend public money on housing in a very narrow density range. It's a long story about that, but it proved to be impossible for us to negotiate anything better. Similarly, there was a tremendous conservatism among private house building firms about density. They said, we're the judges of what will sell, we're going to build at X houses to the acre, and your attempt to get us to do some of it at triple the density and some of it at half the density is just architectural rubbish, and we won't have anything to do with it. And in a way, that attitude is still common amongst private house builders today, and that report of Letwin recently reported the same thing from studying today's developers. So I think, we failed as planners to anticipate all that and to try and deal with it if we could have done. Maybe we didn't write the plan very well. Maybe we didn't do the drawings very well. I don't think that's enough to explain what went wrong. Because reading the plan again, which I just was doing over the weekend, it really does hammer home what was intended. And I think there is a problem in the discontinuous ownership of a plan. If a plan is prepared by one lot of people, handed over to another lot of people to implement, it's almost inconceivable that there'll be a continuity of concepts and commitment to an idea. The new plan may be better, but it's highly unlikely to be continuous. Now, I want to dwell for another moment or two on the implications of all this for neighborhoods and stuff. I mean, that's a little extract from the plan I showed you before in grey and yellow of a town centre. And it does sometimes make me think that we should do like IKEA does. I mean, this is a very well-known little drawing from IKEA about how to put a drawer front on the side panels of a drawer. And a lot of people do it wrong. They get it wrong because you put it on upside down and you can't then get it off. So what they do is they put this on as well, okay? So before you put the drawer front on, you look at the diagram and you think, right, this is the thing to avoid. You know, we should probably have done that with Milton Keynes and said, if you change the densities, change the speed limits, change the intersection design, you will mess up the bus services, you will mess up the viability of the shops, you will mess up the, if you like, the income distribution impacts of the car versus buses business, and everything will go to pieces. But we didn't. I think we did our best, but we didn't. So how did all this get done? Well, it all got done with magic markers. And people now who are used to working on screens in architecture and planning, there were no screens. There were calculating machines and slide rules. And in the case of the Milton Keynes plan, there were magic markers. Everything was done with these magic markers, which have a wonderful smell. They're kind of glue-sniffing kind of smell. And make good, strong colors, and they're quick and easy and so on. And this drawing on the right here is a typical little bit. I don't have much of it, of the original stuff, but this was drawn by my great friend and collaborator, Michael McCrae, who was a wonderful architect. I really, really enjoyed working with him. He had that very characteristic handwriting and grand style of doing these great diagrams with the magic marker, and that was what we used. Here he is again doing the town centre. And this is the most important drawing. This drawing is a working document of the master plan showing potential points which could be local centres. And you see these are all the midpoints of grid roads. And what we were doing in here was working on them for quite a few days, thinking about each one, what kind of a catchment population it might expect to have for shops, libraries, schools, and all the other things. So deleting some of them as not viable centres, deleting some of them as shopping centres, but keeping them in the plan for other kinds of functions, so as to produce a final list which we were pretty sure would be a successful working set of local centres, and absolutely not defining neighbourhoods. You could walk to other ones if you wanted to. This was the diagram, the version that appeared in the plan, and it interestingly shows some bus stops where these centres are, but it doesn't show all the bus stops. A lot of the bus stops are going to be at the intersections of the grid roads, because to travel through the city you might often have to change buses from a north-south bus to an east-west bus at one of these crossroads. That's now, of course, almost impossible because they're roundabouts and everything is going too fast. So this is just a comparison of where the centres were planned to go in the master plan and where they actually ended up. All pushed into the middle of their grid squares, like Coffee Hall, which is right in the middle of a grid square, Eaglestone, where it's tucked away from the grid road, but quite near the edge, Netherfield, where it's really buried in the area. So I'm going to stop there. I mean, that's some, if you like, some empirical stuff about the experience of working on this plan and what happened to it in the space between doing it and the implementation. I think this approach to neighbourhoods and neighbourhood centres and the distribution of local shops was extremely good. I think it was the most important positive thing about this entire plan. You couldn't really do it now because of permitted development rights and so on. which allow any shop to be converted into housing pretty well. But it was very important at the time, and perhaps in one future day we'll be able to do things like this again. Right, finish.
Thanks, Michael. I'll just wait for my slides to come up. Great. So it's great to be here. Thanks for the invitation. It's especially nice after I organised a roundtable discussion in Milton Keynes gallery featuring Michael, David Locke and a few other people, old and new, who had been involved in the planning of Milton Keynes. Obviously, as the chair, I wasn't really able to put forward any of my own views, so it's quite nice to have the chance to do that. So it's great to be here. I finished my PhD thesis at the University of Manchester on planning history and architecture about a year ago, and I've been sort of thinking about how to disseminate it. You know, what was the point of all of that? And so it's good. I'm keen to be able to share some of that with you now. Just on the sort of structure of the talk, I'm going to talk briefly about the sort of the occasion, like what are the kind of features out there in the world that I'm responding to, some caveats, two kind of more images, more kind of like high level, kind of almost artistic kind of moments, expositions, then some theses. I think I might cut out the non-plan bit because I'm worried about going on for too long. And then I'm going to focus on Melvin Webber, who you didn't mention, but whose ideas were kind of quite important and who, to some of the early planning of Milton Keynes, and who I really focused on in the chapter of my PhD on Milton Keynes, because I found his ideas to be quite curious and worthy of further study. So just on the occasion question, sort of, maybe that's not the right word for it, but what's the kind of object of critique, I suppose? And I think it's the kind of rise of a new modernism in contemporary built environment profession. And I'll come back to this a little bit more in later. Question of policy paradigms today, gentrification and sustainable urbanism on the one hand, and then the question of new towns and the long time that's now elapsed since any new towns that were really ambitiously planned in Britain. The return to the kind of debate over new towns versus inner cities. What is the meaning of new towns? And then a few thoughts on the concept of placemaking, which you did bring up already, and I agree it's a kind of vague term, but my position is that the planning of post-war British new towns were only possible amidst political common ground on ideas about what made for a good community. And to plan and to populate a new town required more nerve than just to redevelop an urban area. It seems apparent that there is a kind of built utopian quality to the planning and settlement of urbanization of a rural area and giving it that new identity of a new town. I strongly believe that ambition, however fraught politically, ought to be appreciated. With regards to the present, we could say that the inability of contemporary planning or placemaking to give and advocate for the creation of new communities or new towns is symptomatic of a general lack of social alignment. Such projects require a singular vision. I'm also interested kind of conceptually in the question of the environment, the question of the countryside, what is conservation when it comes to land about, how to make sense of this, the phenomenon of the English countryside. I taught a class at the University of Manchester entitled Urban Anti-Urbanism, which was a great way of kind of exploring some of that contradictory history. And then I'm also interested in the way in which ideas become spatialized in place, and the ideological carrying capacity, or maybe the intellectual leverage of cities, particularly capital cities. Every 20 years, there seems to be a wave of redevelopment or regeneration of London, and it seems to convey a kind of discrete style which is actually the term used by planning historian Alison Rivets. That style which conveys more than simply a combination of architectural style or architectural fashion and legislation. The other kind of occasion that I think is worth just mentioning, the last few months, I think there's been a real kind of emergence of a bit of a political debate potentially running up to the next general election over the question of inner city regeneration versus rural housing development. Obviously with the Labour Party kind of orientating itself towards house building more actively. But over the last couple of years, the news has been full of overseas. This is the line in Saudi Arabia, and bold and ambitious projects for new towns. This was in the news more recently in Silicon Valley, in California. Like, it seems to me like the concept of new towns is like back in the zeitgeist, if not in Britain, then elsewhere. Finally, I just want to say, like, the new town is greater than the sum of its parts. It's also a social artifact with a narrative, and it gives form, meaning, and longevity to a moment of social surplus. Some caveats. My PhD kind of positionality was as a historian, kind of looking down on the melee of politics from up in the ivory tower, sort of safe and sound. And I guess as an academic, one of the advantages is that you're fortunate to have like a great deal of independence from the boss, from the money, from the party line. And I tried my very best to kind of exploit that as much as possible, this rare autonomous position. I also allowed myself, to try to be as independent from political agendas as possible, and to look at the contradiction-ridden question of policy, problems and solutions. Looking back, I wonder whether that embrace of independence risks kind of developing a slightly evasive or like elusive attitude, which can be kind of isolating. So forgive me for not having like honed my public speaking or sort of presentation skills as much as I would have liked to have done. But most of this really comes from the summer of 2019 that I spent living in Milton Keynes, thanks to a placement at the Milton Keynes City Discovery Centre, which is a charity based there, where I organised the round table that I mentioned, and came into contact with a lot of planners who had been working on Milton Keynes, who had kind of stayed there long afterwards, and people in that kind of orbit, one or two people here today. And so that was a really great experience, and really did shape a lot of the ideas and sort of direction that my work's gone in subsequently. Now I work for the RTPI, where I'm an officer working on behalf of members, the planning profession, and their elected representatives, and my role there is to support and promote planning research, which again changes my sort of purpose and positionality. And obviously I'm not representing the RTPI in this. This is kind of with my academic research hat on. So I'm going to now go into the kind of two expositions. So this first one, this quote that I found fascinating from Zbigniew Brzezinski, who was councillor to President Lyndon Johnson in 1966 before becoming President Jimmy Carter's national security advisor. Ours is no longer the revolutionary era. We are entering a novel metamorphic phase in human history. The world is on the eve of a transformation more dramatic than its historic and human consequences than that wrought by the French or Russian revolutions. Shocking though it may sound to their acolytes, by the year 2000, it will be accepted that Robespierre and Lenin were mild reformers. I guess what I find fascinating about this quote is just how wrong it is. Like, from the contemporary perspective, its history's proved it wrong, but when you scratch below the surface, I still find it fascinating, and I wonder whether maybe it was just that the year 2000 was too soon, and perhaps some of the social and historical dynamics that were being observed here are still at play. So this quote cited in a paper by Melvin Webber, who I'm going to get to. Melvin Webber, let me see. Historian of Milton Keynes, Guy Ortolano, writes that Webber, quote, anticipated a world so unknowable as to undermine planning altogether. Webber saw telecommunications and shifting kinship relations to be creating a geographical liberalization of community bonds. This in turn called into question the very basic understanding of the urban and of human settlement. As a result, Webber predicted further urban decentralization, reductions in residential and employment densities, and a geographical shift in development away from industrial urban centres. Just as with the inaccuracy of Brzezinski's political ideological analysis, the inaccuracy of Webber's predictions about the future of urban form is striking. He seemed to be unable to conceive of the possibility of what Neil Smith later called the, quote, generalization of gentrification as a global urban strategy. I'm going to move on to this is now the second kind of exposition, sort of, this is meant to be kind of impressionistic rather than an analytical, but these are three quotes that I found striking. I also wrote about the redevelopment of London's docklands in the early 1980s and the kind of shift in policy and ideas about development that occurred between Milton Keynes and London Docklands, despite the continuity of professionals who work between the two organisations. These quotes all I'm not going to read them all out, but they all narrate views from the air, from high up, like aerial perspectives on the kind of empty, desolate waterscapes of ruin and loss. And they all kind of convey a sense of opportunity and of lost potential and of some kind of motive to seize this like landscape, almost like a natural, beautiful landscape, as an opportunity for reurbanization. Sorry if this is all a bit like vague and impressionistic, but here's some images just to kind of illustrate that. These were like taken in black and white camera, as if to try to like create this nostalgic impression of the ruined docklands. So I think this is the West India Docks, where Canary Wharf now is. So it's quite a dramatic transformation. So the theses, exploring the rise of urban regeneration and its relationship to the new town planning paradigm. I'm exploring how in the 1960s there seemed to be this separation between the likes of futurist suburbanists predicting the end of the city, and then on the other side, the rise of interest in the city as such, the kind of reification of the city. This crisis, this is both like the crisis and the overcoming and the reification of the city all at once. My dissertation attempted to measure the appeal of millennial socialist sentiment, both pro-state and pro-community, against the ideas and horizons of an older 1960s generation on the left. This is so as to productively critique contemporary nostalgic socialism in a positive sense, in a more remote and negative sense, to critique the original horizons of the new left as well as the kind of falling below that original memory. The original intellectual content of postmodernism was a product of the new left's exhaustion and was expressed in its most distilled form in the thought of Marxist critic Manfredo Tafuri, put simply that architecture cannot revolutionize society within capitalism. Much as contemporary democratic socialists have failed to engage with the positive content of anti-communism, to use a phrase of American socialist historian Jack Ross, to refer to the kind of the Trotskyist critique of the Soviet Union, in failing to adequately engage with the positive ideological content of postmodernism, contemporary neo-modernist and anti-postmodernist tendencies fall into pastiche, resurrecting past problems and failing to observe the wickedness of the problem at hand. Sorry if that was a bit dense, but again, my public speaking skills, some of this was kind of copied and pasted from my dissertation. So I'm now going to move on to talking more directly about Milton Keynes. My approach to Milton Keynes is deliberately kind of agonistic. I feel the urge to defend it against its detractors, but I also feel the urge to critique it against its defenders, some of whom see it as like a kind of bastion of social democracy. I guess my thesis is overall that, well, I'll get to that. Charlesworth and Cochrane state that, quote, at first glance, Milton Keynes looks like the ultimate confirmation that we've reached the end of history and achieved victory of space. Right, that was from the 1990s, and the quotation gives Milton Keynes a kind of parable-like quality. The postmodernism of Weber and others, like the New Left of which it gave birth, failed, and Milton Keynes is today a relic of a particular moment of critique and is widely misunderstood. Milton Keynes was conceived as a, quote, experimental laboratory, a radical and long-sighted experiment in social policy design. That's from Weber. Its ideologues and plans express a historically significant advancement, perhaps terminal, of the post-war Radburn type of Newtown philosophy in light of significant social change. Milton Keynes is, quote, spearheading this changing phase in urban civilization. So all of these kind of bold claims, all made by Weber, who I should have really said by now, was brought into the Centre for the Environment Studies by various people at UCL and otherwise, all connected to Richard Crossman and Llewellyn Davis and the planners that contracted Nathaniel Litchfield and Michael to work on the early plan. He was this Californian futurist who was part of the kind of cybernetic systems theory kind of early computing moment, who seized on urban planning as a particularly wicked problem, an analysis which I think is still accurate. I think the thing that, just to add on to Michael, your talk, that the crucial phrase that it was the neighbourhood unit, which was the kind of building block of post-war Britain in a sense. That was the kind of, it was popularised in the US as a kind of strange transatlantic dialogue. But it was essentially the size of like the catchment area of an elementary primary school. And it was the way in which most of the post-war new towns were planned, around these discrete communities, decentralized from the center. The crucial innovation of Weber and of his sphere was to say that the neighborhood unit was a kind of paternalist impulse to try to plan communities from above in these small pseudo-villages was actually backward-looking. And this was the thinking, as far as I understand it. In the 1960s, the future of telecommunications and of mobility was ever expanding, and networks of association and identity were much greater in scale, and thereby the kind of basis of the urban as having been territorial and about propinquity, meaning placeness and togetherness, was being overridden by telecommunications and mobility. Milton Keynes for Weber was therefore all about trying to conceive of an urban future that was post-place and was networked and mobile. I think I'm going to skip the non-plan section, but just to those of you who aren't familiar, it was an essay published in the periodical New Society by Rainer Banham, Cedric Price, Peter Hall, and others, which really was like a critique, a substantial critique of planning as such. It's now probably most well remembered for being the basis, or the debatable basis, of the enterprise zone concept. But I think it actually had a much broader effect on the planning profession and its kind of, perhaps you could say, loss of nerve, or its liberalization than just that trajectory. It was a kind of left libertarian or anarchistic advocacy of individual autonomy, untrammeled by governmental authority, and kind of echoes of the critique of Stalinism and of the Soviet Union and of the welfare state, imported from the kind of liberalization of the US ongoing at that time. It does mention Melvin Webber. This is the only other thing I'll say about non-plan. And it does mention Milton Keynes, despite the fact it was written in 1968, which was the very early form ideation of Milton Keynes' moment. Oh wait, before I go on to Webber again, I'm just going to mention Cumbernauld. Cumbernauld was, for those of you who aren't familiar, a new town in Scotland between Edinburgh, sort of to the west of Edinburgh, which was the only really real new town that was of the second generation of new towns. Most were built either in the fairly early after the Second World War or in the mid to late 1960s. Cumbernauld was from the 50s and was a real kind of unusual example of a very centralized, or a new town with a very distinct centre. A lot of the planning of this time in the 60s was a kind of reaction to the lesson learned at Cumbernauld, which is quite technical, but I think I want to talk about it because it kind of follows from some of the diagrammatic work that Michael showed on the screen, which was essentially that if you build a new town with a very dominant centre and with roads kind of encircling it to provide access for a large catchment area to it, it's actually then difficult to expand outside of that geographical area because you've already built the kind of containing ring around it. And to build, and it was also to do with the calculations of transport planners at that time that to have a central enough centre, you needed grade-separated road junctions, which are much more costly to support that heavy centre. And so it creates all this kind of inflexibility moving forwards when you have a very centralised town centre in a new town. That was the argument of the 60s, looking back at Cumbernauld. So Melvin Webber is best remembered for having popularised the idea of wicked problems, a term which became a way of talking about necessarily complex, non-linear problems, particularly in design thinking. The term originated in a paper with Horst Rittel, where they reflected on the challenges which politics and social change in the 1960s had presented the planning profession. Their tone was neither celebratory of social change nor oppositional, but inhabited a mutedly combative, realist position. They noted the 1960s demise of an earlier anxiety about homogeneous mass society, think of suburbia, the interwar critique of sprawl, the kind of fear of the mass mind, of ad mass, of advertising. Instead, they argued that societies of the Western world were becoming increasingly heterogeneous, citing growth of knowledge, information, affluence, the awareness of the liberty to deviate or differentiate. In comments that appear today to be prescient of subsequent change, the authors found this new social pluralism to be manifesting in a desire for at least subcultural identity. Cheekily recognizing a certain irony, they added, "We almost dare say that irregular cultural permutations are becoming the rule." In light of such changes, the idea of wicked problems functions as an argument that technocratic problem analysis, solution-focused approaches to planning and public policy were being challenged. Rittel and Webber argued that in wicked problems, the information needed to understand the problem depends upon one's idea for solving it, rendering problems necessarily kind of political. Moreover, the problems that planners must deal with are wicked and incorrigible ones, for they defy efforts to delineate their boundaries and to identify their causes. Planners were therefore confronted with a, quote, growing pluralism of the contemporary publics whose valuations of his proposals are judged against an array of different and contradicting scales, which threatened the very conception of a singular public. And I suppose what I'm trying to get to here is this, this sentiment that was kind of pernicious at the time, which was that there was a crisis of road building, of master planning, of architectural modernism, moreover a crisis of state developmentalism, and of the post-war New Deal epoch, and a kind of consensus around how development and what a good community looked like at that time. I'm at risk of ripeating myself ever so slightly from before, so I'm just kind of jumping forward. So bear with me. Apologies for kind of not having quite as much time to prepare. Weber also, I think, just extemporizing a little bit on what I was talking about before, I think there's this discussion at the time about what the future of post-industrial society was going to look like. I think the Britain's urban geography is distinctly industrial. It's structured. Well, there's Roman roads, but I think the kind of the structure of the railway networks was really what's kind of determines most of the population and employment centres of Britain. Weber's thinking about that and is thinking how the car, as a much more decentralised and autonomous mode of transport, is potentially going to liberalise or change the distribution of people in space. Urban concentration and gentrification, as implicated in the return of capital and populations to industrial urban centres, as well as of placeness in the post-Jacobsian rise of placemaking, are all hinted at by Weber as particular currents, but their dramatic growth after 1968 appears, with hindsight, to have been unexpected. Such early phenomena of a rise in what is today familiar philosophies associated with concentrated urbanization are referenced by Weber as anti-auto ideology, a phrase which I find kind of amusing, to which, perhaps in agreement with, which Weber puts the post-war British new towns and other designs as anti-auto ideology. Weber also sees the accusation of Los Angeles as a kind of cultural desert as stemming from the myth whose basis lies in the ideology of metropolitan form. More surprisingly was Weber's indictment of the new towns as backward-looking. So he's referring to the post-war new towns here. He says that they're characterized by monarchies and pre-industrial times. I guess that refers to this kind of neighborhood unit, village-like kind of quality. Weber's attitude later the year in 1968, when helping to conceive of Milton Keynes, would advocate, therefore, with a radical break from the past. I just want to finish with one last kind of set of thoughts, which was about, and I guess this is the most recent reflections I've been having about the Newtown movement. I tend to sort of think of Weber as this rare and unusual moment in the 20th century where a vision that was as purely anti-urban as possible was attempted. A kind of deterritorialization of the urban, a kind of spread of the population across the territory. I mean, there's an American architect whose name suddenly escapes me from earlier in the century who's did some similar kind of ideas. I think isn't it Frank Lloyd Wright in his Broadacre City concept? But nonetheless, it strikes me now that, I guess at one point in time, the TCPA's perspective on new towns would have been as a kind of rural resettlement project, that the English countryside had previously been much more populated, that industrialization as a great loss had kind of caused it to have to migrate into these terrible Victorian slums, but the re-urbanization of the English countryside was a net positive for society. Similarly, I think this question of what is a city, what is it that makes a kind of gives it identity and a kind of having a character of having a sum greater than the sum of a whole greater than some of its parts to a new town, a new city that's different to a suburb. I think these suggest a kind of urbanism to the New Towns movement. So I'm just going to leave you with that, which is a kind of reflection on the urban or anti-urban quality of new towns. Thanks very much.
Tom, do we need the microphone for questions? Or should we just... Is anybody burning to comment or question? It's always very difficult after there's been a... It's always... Can you hear me properly? Well, Michael's in the loop. Because if there are questions, I'd quite like to put some points, but to him in the first place.
Microphone's not working. Is it switched on? It's just not working. I'm just trying to make it work. It's not working.
Do you want to use that one?
Close to where microphone is, that will pick you up.
Is that better?
Use the one by the
Use this one.
Use that one. So if somebody, while we're waiting for Michael, if there's somebody here who wants to speak, they should use this or...
Yes. Ignore it, that one doesn't work.
Lights. You can hear me. Hear me. Okay. Well, while we're working, I mean, he's coming. I was going to ask you about Bangalore Broadacre. But, Michael, as a question, I'd quite like to relay, being perhaps in age similar to you, some experiences that I had in travelling through your comments about when you were working at Nathaniel Litchfield's, and the question of densities. When I qualified as an architect, I worked in the Ministry of Housing in the research group, which looked at council housing, basically. And it was made up of various people in the Ministry. I realised there were people in a lot of different sorts of disciplines in the Ministry of Housing, including quantity surveyors. And because there were such large housing programmes, the way they had a thing called the housing cost yardstick that related to this, which was a very, over time, having seen this there, I then went and worked in an authority and designed and built council housing under this regime of this housing cost yardstick. And the yardstick was based actually on previous earlier costs for what were regarded as similar sorts of buildings. This was translated into charts related to densities, because it was assumed that at higher densities you had certain problems that you didn't have at lower densities. And they related the money that you were allowed to these densities. One of the things that it did was that if you increase the car provision in your housing, almost up to 1-to-1 or something, you got a bonus on your density and on the money you got to spend on housing. One could look at this system in various ways, and I don't want to be neurotic about it, but thinking back to your analysis of the grids at Milton Keynes, and thinking back to Fred Pooley, who had worked earlier on scheme, I think, who was someone who was quite keen on transport and transport systems. And he wasn't employed, I don't think, on Milton Keynes, but he went to GLC and he dealt with transport there. And he basically got done the Thameslink railway link north-south through London, which is a rail link, not a car means of transport, that eventually came about and worked very well. And I think he was quite keen on monorails and other forms of mobility, and that he clearly, those sort of things technically and what the implications were at variance with certain wishes about providing for the car, and the car being a means of liberating people. So at a certain point in the development, when you were in Lichfield, we've talked about the sort of split and the way it went. Is what I'm saying of any relevance?
Yes, I wanted to make two comments on what you've just said. The first is about housing densities and the housing cost yardstick and so on. When we went to the ministry to say to them, look, we want to propose densities which range from double or treble the viable maximum under the housing cost yardstick when you're at a point of high accessibility, right through your normal range to some very low densities, miles from the 500 meters from the transport nodes, where there might be allotments and very spacious housing with communal gardens and that kind of thing. And they, in repeated meetings, refused to allow that to go into the plan. They wanted the densities to be kept within this range. We had our own quantity surveyors too, and we argued, with their support, that the costs of construction in the context where the land is freely available. I mean, we didn't have to worry about land cost. I mean, there was a land cost, but it was, if you like, pooled across the whole city area. It wasn't specific to particular sites. That therefore, this was one of the liberating things about the Newtown Act machinery. You could act independently of land market pressures on particular pieces of land. But the ministry wouldn't hear of this. They said they'd developed this set of rules about densities, which, generally speaking, made the housing cost yardstick a good guardian of public money and prevented squandering and so on. So they just wouldn't budge on this. We later discovered that they had commissioned some research from a rather good land economist called Dennison, Professor Dennison, about these issues of density and housing cost. And they weren't telling us about this, and they sat on his report for quite some years, finally published it as a book which was called, I think, Housing Development, Land and Costs, which took our side very much and not theirs. I mean, it really supported our point of view that you could build quite a wide range of densities if you stopped fretting about land costs. So we thought they were being devious and conservative and, protecting their national standard system, rather like a school teacher who says, well, what would happen if everybody did it? That sort of argument. Well, new towns are different. You don't have to do the same as everybody else. So that's one comment I would make. The other is about railway and monorail type transport and so on as the basic structure for articulating city form rather than cars. And one thing which happened in the first few months of the Milton Keynes consultancy project was that Nat Litchfield and I and the other people in the Litchfield office and a few of the younger people in the Llewellyn Davis office, including Mike McRae, felt that the ideas in the Fred Pooley approach had been quite wrongly shunted aside, and that we should do a proper cost-benefit analysis of approaches based on not necessarily monorail, but a fixed track, high-capacity tramway or something system with dense building close to it, and compare that with the freedoms and costs and benefits you would have with a Milton Keynes type car-based system. And we were absolutely refused permission to do that. I mean, we weren't even allowed to put the paper to the board of whatever they were called, board of directors. It was just Llewellyn Davis and Walter Bohr sat on it. It was just absolutely out of the question. So that's my second comment.
Michael, would the density have been higher or lower without the housing cost yardstick regime?
I don't think it was an issue about the overall density or the average density. It was about the range of variation of density.
Right.
I don't recall anybody wanting to densify the city as a whole, as you probably would do now in a kind of global warming and environmental crisis situation, because at that time we didn't know about that. We didn't know that was coming down the road. I don't think many people did. No, it was nothing to do with fitting more people in or saving land. It was purely to do with the supporting good services, supporting good public transport, and offering a much wider range of places in which to live.
I read it described as like a pincer-like regime, the way in which the housing cost yardstick and the Parker-Morris standards came together to create that density sort of structure that you talked about that was quite specific.
Well, I think I'm not knowledgeable or scholarly enough on the housing cost yardstick to be able to answer that. There are probably people in the room like you who are.
Say something on that. Yeah. I mean, what did happen when in some of the earlier housing that was built there, if I think of Netherfield or Bean Hill, they had terrible problems with the housing cost yardstick. I mean, and they, as housing schemes, within a few years you could see they were going to fall apart almost. And there was definitely a gap between I think the administration of the housing cost yardstick for the densities and the locations that they were doing it in. So I don't know whether anybody else knows about this or stuff.
We need some historians of quantity surveying and that kind of thing in this discussion.
My bitter lesson was when I ceased being a bureaucrat in the Ministry of Housing and became an architect, having to get this housing built was I learnt the language of quantity surveyors, and you could talk to them. But the first housing scheme that I designed, it actually came in far lower than the estimate when the tenders came in really low. I got really cross with quantity surveyors, and you learn. One of the things of doing having a financial regime and a problem and a design solution is if you repeat it, you can learn and do a bit better each time. And I found after a few years that, in fact, when there was in my area, there was a competition for designing housing, which I won out of 50 people. And the reason I won it was that the judge knew what you could do within the yardstick, and I had learned where you could apply the money and do it. So that, like all these systems, you could find your ways around them. But yeah.
This remark you just made reminds me of some research which a colleague of mine called Graham Winch did in the Bartlett some years ago, comparing British and French architectural firms and their success in international competition. The issue being that big British architectural offices seem to manage to do very well globally, capturing jobs across the world, whereas French ones on the whole didn't. And his conclusion from doing really a lot of empirical research on this was that in Britain, architecture firms tended to develop long-standing relationships with developer clients, with quantity surveyors, with engineers, so that they would go into a job with this whole set of relationships pre-structured, and they could do a very good job in those circumstances. Whereas the normal French arrangements were hamstrung by the fact that so many jobs were put out to competition. And competition means young firms get a good look in, beginners get a good look in, individuals like you get a good look in, but you don't tend to have these long, slow build-ups over many years of relationships between different firms. And he attributed a lot of the difference to that, which I thought was an interesting kind of thing. And the whole business of how procurement is done in architecture and planning is a nightmare field, and I know it's a disaster for a lot of architects and for a lot of built environment. In a way, it's behind the Grenfell Tower disaster too. So, I mean, there's a lot to be done about that.
Can I make a comment? Actually, that doesn't work. Speak that to the microphone. But it doesn't make any difference. I'm sorry I missed the beginning of your talk about Milton Keynes. You may have touched on this subject, but looking at the plans of Milton Keynes, I'm always struck by the fact that the A5, the Roman road, is a dead straight right through. And then the rest of the grid, applied by modern designers, is a loose net. In other words, it doesn't have geometrical principles. And there's this terror of geometry. And it made me think, yes, terror of geometry. If you propose geometry, you're inhuman, you're dogmatic, you're doctrinaire, etc. But if you think of Corbusier at Chandigarh, that is exactly what he did. The plan for Chandigarh had been drawn up by the American planner and architect Nowitzki. I can't remember the name of the planner, but anyway, it was a kind of Milton Keynes type scheme. It was full of curves everywhere. There wasn't a straight line in it. And then Corbusier was brought in when Nowitzki was killed in an air crash. And he sort of basically accepted the principle of the layout, but he straightened it all up. In other words, the grid then became a true grid, a geometrical grid, and with the Capitol at the northern end near the Himalayas, and then the grid deflected just where it met a watercourse or some natural feature that required a deflection. And the result is a unity, because geometry creates unity and comprehensibility. But that is nowhere in any of the British new towns, and certainly not in Milton Keynes. But with the A5 going dead straight right through one, you'd have. I'll just ask you whether it was considered, whether a clue might have been taken from the A5 to establish a kind of coherent geometrical framework for the plan.
Well, I'll use this because it doesn't benefit people in the room, but it benefits people who are listening online. I can't really comment on that. Somebody must have decided to do it that way. It could well have been the transport engineers on the project, who were a Canadian firm called Pete Marwick. And they had a team of 5 or 6 engineers who came and worked on this. They didn't work in the same office as everybody else. They had a separate office in a building in Woburn Square. But they really were the authors of the road system. Sorry?
So the key decisions from an architectural point of view were handed over to these engineers?
Well, I can't tell you. I can't tell you. I just can't tell you the power balance in that decision. I do remember talk of adjusting this grid to the contours of the land and making it fit round valuable bits of forest and waterway and lakes and stuff. So there was some sense of naturalizing a grid a bit. From the point of view of legibility and navigation, I agree with you absolutely. I mean, it is a nightmare getting around, finding a way in Milton Keynes. And if you look at the websites of a lot of companies based there, they have a whole page on their website about how to get to their office. Take the 5th exit from roundabout 12 on H3, and after 20 meters turn left onto blah, 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 and long descriptions. And that's very common, and people do get lost. It really is not navigable at all easily. And I think the fact that the roads bend slightly to slow approaching traffic down at the approach to each roundabout, which you have to do if they're going at 70 miles an hour, destroys that sense of going straight through the roundabout, because you're doing all this wiggling. So, I mean, in practical terms, I agree with you completely, and nobody took a lead from the A5. The Romans did it straight, and I can't answer it. You need to find some more people who are still alive from the time, or who wrote about it at the time.
Yes.
Thank you. My name is Tim Skelton. I'm chair of Milton Keynes Forum, which is a civic society. I think I'm probably only person from Milton Keynes in the audience at the moment. I worked for the Development Corporation for 10 years from 1979 to 89 as a chartered surveyor rather than an architect. And just to pick up a number of points. The grid road wiggle, I think the influence on that was Peter Youngman, the landscape consultant. There is an article on the web called Why Grid Roads Wiggle, I think by Andrew Mahadi, who was an urban designer who worked for the Development Corporation. So you can find that. Just to pick up a number of points though, Michael's point is what went wrong. I think it's what was different would be a better title. Because Milton Keynes has been hugely successful and it is well loved by its inhabitants. And you know, the seal of approval was Richard Llewellyn-Davies himself, who came back and on a number of occasions afterwards kept a very close relationship with the Development Corporation and was very pleased with what had happened. So you know, that is a kind of stamp of approval from him. But also it's important for anybody looking at Milton Keynes from the outside to understand how the Development Corporation worked, because there were, for the key period of the 1970s, there were three multidisciplinary design teams. One dealt with the south, one dealt with the centre, and one dealt with the north. The one in the centre, to pick up the point a few minutes ago, the complete road network of the central Milton Keynes and the surrounding grid squares is completely orthogonal, completely straight down. There's a myth that it's lined up with sunrise, which is an urban myth. I think that's not correct. But the point is that the history of Milton Keynes, the design history that people read, tends to be shaped by 2 or 3 housing estates that have been mentioned tonight already, Netherfield, Bean Hill, that were designed by the team who dealt with the south of Milton Keynes. And they were the slightly wacky houses that appeared in the press. The team that dealt with the north of Milton Keynes was less publicised, but that was more true to the layout that was in the master plan. And the local centres, if you look at the north of Milton Keynes, are exactly where they were supposed to be. On the edge of grid squares, with underpasses linking into the adjoining areas. And I live in the northeast of Milton Keynes, and we haven't got a local centre that we can walk to quite easily. So that kind of flexibility works. But there's also the practicalities of actually how you build a city, and I think Michael's comment was probably a very good one about prescription and what they didn't leave behind for us to see. And there's the whole issue about the master plan talks about corridors of 80, landscape corridors of 80 metres wide. So that is there in the master plan, and it is difficult to get an urbanity from that, other than kind of pinch points. But also this practicality that when you're designing a city and getting it built, the easiest thing if you design things in squares is to give squares to people.
Yep.
Rather than like a quarter of a square,
Yep.
a quarter of the next door square. And then when you're letting out housing contracts,
Yep.
How do you let out a single housing contract to a contractor
Yep.
where you've got an 80-metre gap in the middle and you're moving across? So, the prescription that Michael said is missing was a shame, because it could perhaps give us some clues as to how to get around that. But there is this kind of practicality of building a city and letting contractors, again, to pick up the point about the local centres, the position was half in one grid square, half in another. I've recently come across a paper about how Milton Keynes was being named, the individual areas, and this practicality of getting people around this new place with signs and area names and things like that. And if you get to some place like East Neath Hill or West Neath Hill, it's complicated if you're driving around. If somebody says, well, you live in a straight place, what's your address? And when you get there, you're in the Western East, you don't know necessarily that it is Western East. This is pretty sat nav. So the easiest thing, you split something in squares, the square is designed by a team, and it has a common design form. But that was the early days of and the corporation learned from all this. It wasn't a rigid dogma. The local centres, the connectivity, they realised by the late 1970s they weren't getting it right, so stuff was reinvented. So it was a continual design process, and it was a fascinating story once you start piecing it all together. And it's just brilliant that we've got Michael here as one of the, probably the only surviving, as you said, the member of the team still alive in the UK, and to be able to hear his experiences, particularly someone like me who went there to help build it and is now recording it. I met Michael on a couple of occasions. It's very important, but it is just a fascinating place, and it works, and it is loved by these people. A number of years ago there was a survey on resident satisfaction in Milton Keynes. The figure was something like 90% of people, residents have interviewed, loved it. And the average in the UK was about 45% satisfaction where they live. And given that you'll never get 100%, that is an astonishing figure, and it's a tribute to Michael and his colleagues for doing all that work, setting out this plan, and inspiring the corporation to build it. It's a fascinating place, and in public I like how Michael and his colleagues for all the work they did. It's a brilliant result. It's not perfect, but a lot of it is very, very good.
I want to raise one or two points with David, but first of all, can I just say I'm very glad that Tim is here. It would be good if there were lots of residents from Milton Keynes here. I was delighted that you said just before we started the meeting that you're writing a book about it all. I think we're all responsible, us very old people, for writing this stuff down before we die. I'm doing it at the moment on King's Cross, which occupied me for 20 years or so. Because I've got another story to tell about King's Cross in opposition to the official line, which sees it as a great success story. And you've got a line on Milton Keynes and a lot of detailed knowledge which needs to be put down, and the more people can do that, the better, I think. I'm not surprised that a lot of people are very happy with it, because in a world of high motor car ownership and most of the people having incomes that will sustain the use of enough cars and pay for the housing, in a way it's a wonderful kind of set of living conditions. And I suppose I'm criticizing it partly because it's so unsatisfactory for the world we're now in, where we've got to stop using motor cars, we've got to minimize the amount of travel we do, we've got to think differently about the way land is used because of food production and all that. And it's not something we should do again. Absolutely not something we should do again. I'm not surprised people are happy with it. I suppose the people who really hate it have left. I know a few of them. And the people who like that kind of stuff have gone there and stayed. The first time I addressed a large meeting of Milton Keynes residents on all this stuff, there was a lot of resistance to my arguments about traffic speeds and the road design. But I said after about a quarter of an hour of being bombarded with criticisms, I said, well, all the people who've spoken so far are men. Could we hear please from some of the women, who are just as many women in the room as men? And then we started getting completely different kinds of comments, because they were the people who had to find a way of getting to work in the morning, stopping with children at 2 different schools on the way, and then getting to work and then getting back, taking a child to the dentist, and all those complicated trip chaining operations that you have to do if you're looking after small children. And it was, a lot of them didn't have access to the car. So there was a different, gender response to the way the plan was working. This was about 15 years ago, but I wanted to ask David, the importance of this Melvin Webber to me was his insistence, which now would be regarded as common sense, his insistence that this notion of community, of people's connection to each other, was becoming a non-spatial connection. In fact, his main published work was called, rather pompously, it was called The Urban Place and the Non-Place Urban Realm, wasn't it? That was a kind of fancy way of saying, that you have strong connections with your trade union, your bridge club, your political party, your ethnic group, your diaspora of Armenian migrants, whatever you do and are interested in.
Music taste.
What?
Your music taste.
Yes, all that stuff gives you networks of connection, which are terribly important. And maybe the things you go to meetings of, or subscribe to, or join in. And what happens at the local scale in the neighbourhood is becoming less and less important, because you're not all mine workers working in the same coal mine of the same employer, sharing the same experience of all that. To me, that was an eye-opening concept in the 1960s, and really, really, really important and good.
I guess I disagree with you about the need, when you say we need to be less mobile. I disagree with you on that profoundly, in the sense that I think Melvin Webber was correct in celebrating the increase in mobility, because we should all have broad horizons, we should all be able to travel as much as we like, in my opinion, in an ideal world. And I don't think it's progressive to say that we shouldn't have mobility.
Well, this is another huge discussion. But I would say ideal world maybe, but we don't see an ideal world coming down the tracks towards us. We see the opposite, an absolutely disastrous world, which is disastrous in 2 respects. One is the growth of inequality, and the other is the climate and climate disasters. And in the face of that, we've got to find ways of travelling with less environmental damage. We've got to use trains, not aeroplanes. We've got to try and get more things nearer to home than previously, if possible. We probably could reach some compromises about that, but the freedom to do transcontinental air trips and have holidays in the Antipodes is to me something which, is no longer something people could lay much claim to.
I guess there are a lot of different scales there, and I think I'm not convinced, maybe my most controversial suggestion is I'm not convinced that the high density, concentrated city, density sort of paradigm is necessarily, by definition, the most sustainable approach to urbanization.
Yeah, nor me. This is another discussion which I hope you will have, but I agree with you completely. I agree completely. There must be ways of living sustainably at various different densities.
So what makes Milton Keynes necessarily a bad typology as it was built, in the sense that it was low density?
It really only works with a lot of private motor cars.
Can I believe that a certain amount of densification is going on at Milton Keynes, and I would welcome that, provided the greenness. What impresses me whenever I get, not often, to Milton Keynes is the sense of greenness. And of course, to the point you can't see the buildings really, you drive through the place, but you could easily have taller buildings and not covering any more of the ground surface than the present one, but maintain that greenness and raising the density. The grid format allows for a kind of densification process, and
I think that's one of the greatest foresight sort of judgments of the development corporations, was to retain a lot of land ownership and to build at low densities so as to have an extremely long and continuing today process of selling off bits and pieces of land, which provides an enormous income stream for Milton Keynes Council, and continues to benefit the kind of public as a whole in some sense. We can argue about the extent to which that's the case, but that low density permitted a greater holding on to infrastructural common assets, whether parks, green spaces, verges, woodland areas. The wealth of green space allows for greater future ongoing flexibility about land use in a developing city, and that's not an argument that I ever hear being made in planning discussions today, despite the evident success in commercial and planning terms of that judgment that was made early on in most of the new towns.
Though, can I just, I agree that in lots of ways the Milton Keynes plan does provide this flexibility for later densification and infilling. But it absolutely doesn't enable that to happen in that form of densifying up against the grid roads at the midpoints of the kilometre lengths, because that is now much loved woodland on these embankments in the ownership and management of a park trust or something which jealously guards it. And indeed, of course, that's wonderful because we need our tree canopy. The trees play wonderfully important roles in sequestering CO2 and so on. But it does mean that when you propose, as I have done, densifying in at least some of those grid squares, a bit of those intersection points, there's an uproar of environmental concern about loss of trees and loss of vegetation and, biodiversity, net loss. So it's not really available any longer, that freedom.
I suppose the political liberal in me says if the Parks Trust was more democratically run by the residents and people who live in Milton Keynes, then they should be allowed to make their own decision about the disposal or reuse of the land that's commonly held in the community. Whether it's environmental or development, doesn't matter.
It should be possible to densify without covering any more of the ground surface, because the vast majority of the buildings in Milton Keynes are 2 stories. So if you have a 10-story building, which is not, let's face it, the end of the world, you can quintuple the density without taking any trees, any green space, and in fact providing some visual variety and contrast of scale, which is much needed in any case.
Well, I'd be very surprised if that doesn't happen in a spontaneous kind of way. An ordinary market process would make that happen. However, what it wouldn't allow you to do is to make any of these grid roads into city streets with shopping frontages, local services combined with the freedom to stop because that's where your favourite fishing tackle shop is, or your favourite Thai restaurant, or something else like that, or your Catholic primary school, which is the religion you want to send your children to get. Can
I say one more thing? That there's this really interesting concept about the grid, which comes through in the research I've done about the history of the grid concept, which is that it wasn't seen necessarily as being a 70-mile-an-hour dual carriageway. It was seen as this fixed infrastructural asset that was the structuring device of the city as a whole, unlike the residential areas that were kind of the authority to make the decision about how they were to be developed was delegated, as if you were, from the development corporation. The grid, again, it wasn't necessarily a road. It was a collective movement space, and so I think, at least in the idea of a lot of the early thinkers of Milton Keynes, the grid could have been multimodal. It could be a monorail going over the road as well as the road. It could be an underground line underneath the road. It could be all sorts of different things. That's all up for contention, at least in, again, caveat, in the early thinking of the Milton Keynes concept, depending on the future planning. This was the whole point of Melvin Webber, was we don't know what the future is going to be like. Let's plan a city that's indeterminate so that it can change over time, not to be conserved and preserved necessarily in the way that it was dreamt up. Although there's obviously a kind of a conceptual contradiction there of sorts.
Just a bit of sociological history. Webber, who I hadn't heard of before, but he would be, I guess, considered the counterpoint to Wilmot and Young, who were acting 10 years earlier and maybe representative of the aims of the previous generation of newspapers.
Exactly. I actually had a slide that I deleted of photos taken by a photographer in Bethnal Green, Nigel Henderson, who was friends with Wilmot and Young, of children playing in the street in Bethnal Green. And Wilmot and Young were exactly that kind of other side of the 1960s concepts of urbanisation, which was to really find something fascinating in the quality of the city itself, of urban life, and to kind of, consider something beneficial in that togetherness and in that sort of almost slum-like environment, i.e. the slum is not a bad thing. There's qualities of social life and affinity that are being lost in the suburbanisation of working class populations. This is the Wilmot and Young argument, right?
And Jane Jacobs.
Yeah, and then Jacobs kind of follows from that in a way. Yeah, and so Webber is this complete opposite, but also in some ways parallel to Jacobs. They're both influenced by cybernetics, interestingly, and there are some other kind of subsurface parallels despite their apparent, this is sort of the argument of the PhD thesis, that there's this bifurcation of concepts of urban development in the 1960s between densification and decentralization.
I have no idea what cybernetics is.
I'm not sure, yeah.
You want to say something? Yes.
Jim Fennell from in the work that we do now on succession planning, there's often a lot of reference back to garden cities in quite a motive way. Less reference back to the likes of Milton Keynes as undoubtedly our most successful new town. I just wondered, Mark, you set out 3 big issues which you talked about, but the question to both of you, do those 3 big issues, do you think they translate or could translate into the successful planning of new settlements today?
What were the 3 big issues again, sorry?
Well, I had a slide where I said there are 3 big issues. One of them was about housing affordability. The second was this business of the roads and the speeds and the design of the grid. And the third was the business of neighbourhood centres and so on.
How relevant do you think they are, those concepts, to?
I think to me they're tremendously relevant still, and that's why I was focusing on them so much. We really ought to be trying to get those things right. It's much more difficult now because, above all, because the particular crazy version of capitalism which is running the show at the moment is producing such ballooning inequality, such extreme gulfs between rich and poor, which is getting worse in many countries and very much worse in Britain, which makes housing problems so enormously difficult to solve and means that the housing system is extracting money from the incomes of low-income people and tenants particularly, and enriching property owners, owner-occupiers and institutional owners. So the economic housing end of it is incredibly difficult, especially in big cities where this great fetish of agglomeration economics, we must concentrate more and more and more and more into big cities and build Crossrail 2 and Crossrail 3 and so on. To sustain it produces this huge real estate industry and huge house price escalations. So it's going to be very difficult to make it, to change it. But that and the neighbourhood business is very important. I think the neighbourhood services is very important. I don't usually call it 15-minute city because I don't think it helps to pigeonhole it with a particular number of minutes. But the idea that it's good to have a lot of local services, I think, is terribly important.
Essentially, what you presented was a very simple design code, which is what the government talks about, beauty and design codes. But I suspect too often overcomplicates matters. You presented it in a very simple and easy to understand way. Sorry.
Just to add, I think all of the points you make, Michael, about the inaffordability of housing are precisely the arguments for why there should be more new settlement construction to alleviate those pressures. I'm sure that there's great pent-up demand in London for larger housing in more new town-like settings, similarly to other cities in the UK and elsewhere. So I don't think it's like two different things. I kind of agree with you about, well, I think your comment about agglomeration economics is interesting, because I feel like in a way, the sort of sustainable urbanism paradigm is completely in line with that, and actually kind of ends up becoming complicit in the provision in the housing crisis.
Yep.
And that's a huge problem. And I think there's an obvious solution, which is providing some kind of leadership to the development of new communities outside of existing settlements, as well as whatever ongoing urban regeneration efforts are going on.
How well are those little commercial shopping centres doing in Milton Keynes? Because surely the problem lies, if you may be able to walk in 15 minutes or whatever to a few shops, but if, on the other hand, you want to do a lot of a week's family shopping, and you can go to a big Tesco's or Sainsbury's somewhere else and park your car and have a huge, much bigger range than of choice, then I can imagine that that would be the preference for many people, and so the local shopping centre may have one or two convenience shops, but may not actually work financially.
If I could just
Tim may know, he lives there.
That they are all very successful. I think if we go around Milton Keynes now, we'd hardly find a vacant local centre unit.
Amazing.
Good question.
Because there are also there's a big shopping centre in the middle with big supermarkets.
There are larger supermarkets around. It's all carefully thought out, but it is. All the local centres are very successful.
James, there is somebody else who wanted to speak behind you.
Sorry if this question is perhaps deliberately a bit provocative, and I have a hopelessly 21st century vantage point, but I kind of find it hard to understand this impulse of spreading out the population, like even in a world with infinite motor cars and no climate change and so on. I feel like I would still prefer some access to centrality, and centrality to me is not the experience of having a shop within 50 minutes walk or whatever, but similarly to what was said before, I kind of like the idea of having central spaces where the entirety of civil society can come together in a way. That if I want to come to a meeting of people who enjoy conserving the memory of modernism, it can be people from all across London and the southeast or whatever, and not just the community of modernism enjoyers in Harrow or South Acton or whatever. And similarly, if I want a job or if I want a reading group, or if I have a niche subcultural interest, for example, I feel it's important to have a central space which we can all access and come together and so on. And therefore I feel like there is some sort of appeal, some sort of very rational appeal of centrality and big cities and density, that is not reducible to the kind of reification of the city and the reification of the slums and the romanticizing of children playing in the dirt or whatever. So I'm just curious, like, what was the mindset behind this impulse to spread out and so on that I find so hard to grasp now?
Thanks, Gabor. You've clearly never lived in Milton Keynes. I'm being slightly provocative here, but the beauty of Milton Keynes is, assuming you have a car, you can drive from any part of Milton Keynes to any other part of Milton Keynes in literally 10 minutes. And so you can go to your reading group, you can go to your lecture, you can go to the gym, you can go to all these different shopping facilities, and you can vary them you have so much more variety of experience of place, because you have like far more choice of where you choose to do your shopping or where you choose to go. I only lived there for 3 months, but I went to so many different supermarkets. They were all really easy to drive to and to cycle to as well. I would use all of the Redway networks to cycle everywhere as well as drive everywhere and running everywhere. There was just, I guess, that wealth of journey options, rather than being constrained to a kind of radial in and out direction, I found to be, again, I'm sort of speaking ever so slightly ironically here, but I think it was somehow like mind-opening, like about the plurality of movement potential and association potential.
But isn't it just 50-minute cities but with cars?
I guess the 50-minute city concept seems to me to have this kind of decentralized centrality embedded in it, whereas the neighborhood, 50-minute city is just this neighborhood unit concept reinvigorated. Whereas Weber's idea about overcoming the neighborhood unit was really to try to rethink urban structure on a fundamental level, including there was still the activity centers that were decentralized. So maybe you're right. Maybe it was just that.
Yes, please.
So I wasn't going to stop your flow.
No.
It's only that we are getting towards the end of our time here. It's been really fascinating to discuss this new town. What we're missing tonight actually is physical experience of its scale. And one of the things we wanted to do after this talk was actually to have a visit and to move around. My recollection, I worked in Milton Keynes in the 200s to somethings and did things there, was that the greenery was amazing. And we've not talked about the planting. Grids are, whether they're straight, orthogonal, or wobbly, grids are a civilizing device, because in terms of time in your mind, you can work out how long it takes to do things. And that is civilizing. Whether the scale that they're done at in Milton Keynes is the question, and I think we should go there, experience it, and see what it means. Now it's there, it's been done, it had its strange history of how it got there. But so we're going to try and do that on, if I get my dates right, Saturday the 21st of October. We hope the weather will be right then, and you're all welcome to come and join that. So thank you very much for giving us your two different attitudes tonight. It's been absolutely fascinating. And thank you for coming.